On the afternoon of November 4, 2023, in the offices of an Innocence Project chapter in Indianapolis, Indiana, a 68-year-old former HVAC technician named Donald Rinaldi sat across a conference table from two attorneys and a state investigator and made a recorded statement that began with the following sentence. "Everything I said about Marvin Cole at his 2008 trial was a lie. I was not in the alley that night. I did not see him. I did not see anyone." The recording lasted 47 minutes. By the time it ended, Donald Rinaldi had described, in specific and corroborated detail, how he had been pressured by a homicide detective into providing eyewitness testimony that placed Marvin Cole at the scene of a murder Marvin Cole did not commit. Marvin Cole had been in prison for 15 years. He was 41. He had entered prison at 26. This is the story of why Donald Rinaldi spoke on that day, after 15 years of silence and what his lie had cost in the meantime. Donald Rinaldi did not walk into the Innocence Project chapter office unprompted. He had been corresponding with one of the staff attorneys, a woman named Talia Brenner, by mail for approximately 6 months. The initial letter had arrived in May 2023. It was handwritten on a single sheet of lined paper torn from a notebook. The full text of the letter was as follows. "My name is Donald Rinaldi. I gave testimony in the 2008 trial of a man named Marvin Cole. The testimony was not true. I have been thinking about this for many years. I do not know how to make it right. If there is someone there who can talk to me about it, please write back." Talia Brenner had read the letter twice. She had checked it against the chapter's database, confirmed that the Marvin Cole case existed, and that Donald Rinaldi had been a witness in the original trial. And she had written back the same afternoon. The correspondence over the next 6 months consisted of approximately 14 letters from Donald Rinaldi and 10 responses from Talia. The letters were not primarily about the legal substance of what Donald Rinaldi was about to say. They were about whether he could make himself say it. When he finally walked into the office on November 4, he was visibly thin. His hands shook. He had driven himself the 18 miles from his apartment in a small town outside Indianapolis. He had not told anyone in his family that he was making the trip. Talia Brenner has said since, in a profile published in 2024, that the first thing Donald Rinaldi did when he sat down at the conference table was apologize. He apologized to the attorneys for taking up their time. He apologized to a man who was not in the room, Marvin Cole, for being 15 years late. The recorded statement was made over the next 47 minutes. The statement covered 3 subjects. What Donald Rinaldi had actually been doing on the night of June 19, 2007, the night of the murder he had testified about, what he had told the police and later testified to in court, and the specific pressure that had been applied to him in the days between the crime and his original police interview that had caused him to provide false testimony. The statement was made under oath. It was witnessed by 2 attorneys and 1 state investigator. It was by every formal standard of legal recantation, a complete and reliable recantation. The next part of the story is not what happened after the statement. It is what had happened in the 15 years before it. On the night of June 19, 2007, a 23-year-old man named Tyree Madison was shot and killed in an alley behind a convenience store on the east side of Indianapolis. The shooting occurred at approximately 11:40 p.m. Tyree was found by a passerby at 11:52 p.m. and was pronounced dead at the scene. There were no surveillance cameras in the alley. The convenience store's cameras did not cover the alley. The shooting had been witnessed, according to the police canvass conducted in the following 2 days, by no one. The investigation was assigned to a homicide detective named Roger Wexman. Wexman had been with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department for 19 years at the time, and was, by the assessment of his supervisors and peers, an effective closer of cases. His clearance rate was above the departmental average. He was known, among the prosecutors who worked with him regularly, as a detective who could build a case quickly even when the evidence was thin. Marvin Cole entered the investigation as a suspect on June 22, 2007, 3 days after the shooting. He was 26 years old. He lived approximately 7 blocks from the alley where Tyree Madison had been killed. He had no prior convictions but did have 1 prior arrest for a property line dispute that had been dismissed. He had known Tyree Madison casually. They had grown up in adjacent neighborhoods. and had attended the same high school for 2 years before Marvin had transferred. He had been in the area of the convenience store on the evening of June 19, by his own account, but had told Detective Wexman in their first interview that he had left the area at approximately 10:30 p.m. and had been home by 11 p.m. He had no alibi witness since he lived alone. What Marvin Cole did not know on June 22, 2007 was that approximately 24 hours earlier, Donald Rinaldi had given a statement to Detective Wexman placing Marvin Cole in the alley at the time of the shooting. Donald Rinaldi had said in that initial statement that he had been walking back from a friend's house at approximately 11:35 p.m. when he had cut through the alley behind the convenience store and had seen Marvin Cole standing over a man who was already on the ground, and had seen Marvin Cole holding what Rinaldi described as a handgun. Rinaldi had said he had been 20 feet away. He had said he had recognized Marvin Cole because he had seen him around the neighborhood for years. He had said he had not approached, had not called out, had not called 911 because he had been afraid. He had said he had gone home and had told no one until 2 days later when, on hearing about the shooting from a neighbor, he had decided to come forward. The statement was the only direct evidence placing Marvin Cole at the scene. The prosecution built its case around it. The trial in February 2008 lasted 6 days. Donald Rinaldi was the prosecution's third witness. His testimony lasted approximately 90 minutes. He repeated the account from his initial statement. He was cross-examined by Marvin Cole's defense attorney, who pressed him on minor inconsistencies. Rinaldi had been unsure, on cross, about the specific lighting in the alley, and about whether he had heard the actual shot or only seen the aftermath. The inconsistencies were not strong enough to undermine the testimony in the jurors' view. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned a guilty verdict. Marvin Cole was sentenced to 55 years in prison. Donald Rinaldi was 48 years old at the time of the 2008 trial. He worked as an HVAC technician for a residential heating and cooling company. He had been employed there for 14 years. He was, by every available indicator, an unremarkable working-class man. He had been married for 19 years to a woman named Patricia Rinaldi. They had 2 adult children, both of whom lived in the area. He had no criminal history. He had voted in every general election since he was eligible. He had served as a volunteer for a youth football program in the church his family attended. He was not the kind of witness prosecutors usually worry about on the stand. He was steady, polite, and consistent. The prosecutor, in her closing argument, had described him as an ordinary citizen who saw something terrible and did the right thing by coming forward. The jury, by the accounts of 2 jurors interviewed afterward, had found him credible. What the jury did not know was that Donald Rinaldi had not been walking through the alley at 11:35 p.m. on June 19, 2007. He had been at his home, watching a baseball game on television, eating leftovers from a dinner his wife had made. His wife had been in the room with him for the entire evening. He had not seen Marvin Cole. He had not seen Tyree Madison. He had not been within 4 miles of the convenience store at the time of the shooting. What the jury also did not know was that Donald Rinaldi had been approached by Detective Roger Wexman approximately 36 hours after the shooting and had been told that he was being looked at as a potential person of interest in an unrelated case, a residential burglary in a neighborhood adjacent to the alley, in which a witness had described a vehicle similar to Rinaldi's company van. Wexman had told Rinaldi that the burglary investigation could go in different directions, depending on how forthcoming Rinaldi was with information about other matters in the area. Wexman had then asked, in the same conversation, whether Rinaldi had been in the vicinity of the convenience store on the night of June 19, and whether he had seen anything. Rinaldi had said no. He had not been there. Wexman had said, "I'm going to ask you again, and I want you to think carefully. Were you in the area? Did you see anything that might help with this investigation?" The conversation, in Rinaldi's recorded statement 15 years later, continued in that direction for another 40 minutes. The pressure was not described by Rinaldi as overtly threatening. It was described as steady, as guiding, as making clear that Rinaldi had 2 paths available to him. He could continue to say he had not been in the area, in which case the burglary investigation would proceed in a way that might create complications for him. Or he could remember that he had been in the area, that he had cut through the alley, that he had seen Marvin Cole standing over Tyree Madison's body. The second path closed the burglary inquiry without further attention to Rinaldi. The first path did not. Rinaldi took the second path. He gave the statement that became the foundation of the case against Marvin Cole. He signed it. He repeated it on the stand. And then he went home and lived for 15 years with the knowledge that what he had said was not true. The question that the investigators, the attorneys, and the journalists who eventually covered this case have all asked Donald Rinaldi is the question of why. Why 15 years? Why not the year after the trial or the year after that? Why November 2023? Rinaldi's answer in interviews and in the recorded statement has not changed across multiple tellings. It rests on three things. The first is that his wife, Patricia, died in March 2023. They'd been married for 34 years. She had known throughout that her husband's trial testimony had not been accurate. She had not encouraged him to come forward. By his account, she had been afraid of what disclosure might do to their lives, but she had also not pressed him to forget about it. After she died, Rinaldi has said, the only person in the world who knew the truth was him, and the only person in the world who had been holding him to a certain kind of silence was no longer in his life. The silence loosened. The second is that he had been diagnosed with a slow progressing form of cancer in April 2023, 1 month after his wife's death. The prognosis was not immediately terminal. It was, however, a prognosis that, in his own words, made me look at how much time I might have to do something about anything. He was 67 years old. He had 2 adult children and 3 grandchildren. He did not want, he said, to die with this unaddressed. The third was an article he had read in a local newspaper in late April 2023. The article was about a man named Marvin Cole, who had been incarcerated for 15 years for a murder his attorney was attempting to have re-examined under a new Indiana statute that provided for post-conviction review in cases involving single witness identification evidence. The article noted that Cole's case had been previously denied review under earlier statutes, and that the new statute represented one of his last available legal avenues. Rinaldi had read the article 3 times. He had set the newspaper down. He had walked into his backyard and sat on a bench he had built with his son 15 years earlier. He had stayed on the bench, he said, for approximately 2 hours. Then he had gone inside and started writing the letter. These 3 triggers, the death of his wife, the diagnosis, and the article, converged into the action. Forensic psychologists who have studied long-delayed recantations note that this kind of triple trigger convergence is, in fact, the typical pattern. People do not recant on schedule. They recant when the system of pressures that has been keeping them silent erodes, and when a specific external prompt makes the silence feel intolerable. The recorded statement of November 4, 2023, was filed with the court as part of an emergency motion to vacate Marvin Cole's conviction. The motion was supported by independent corroborating evidence the Innocence Project had assembled in the months leading up to Rinaldi's statement. A forensic reanalysis of physical evidence from the original crime scene that, with 2023 DNA technology, had failed to match Marvin Cole to any biological material recovered from the alley. An investigation that had located a witness, a former resident of the apartment building across the alley, who had been 10 years old in 2007, and who had told her parents at the time that she had seen a man running the alley moments after a sound she had thought was a firework, and whose description of the running man did not match Marvin Cole. The witness had been 10, and her parents had not reported the observation to police. The Innocence Project investigator had found her through a social media search. The motion to vacate was granted in March 2024. Marvin Cole's conviction was overturned. He was released the same week. Marvin Cole was 42 years old when he walked out of the Indiana State Penitentiary. He had been incarcerated since the age of 26. He had missed his 20s and his 30s. His mother, who had attended every parole hearing and had written letters to every governor for 15 years, had died in 2021. She had not lived to see her son walk out. His father had died in 2014. His sister was at the gate the morning Marvin Cole was released, and she has said in subsequent interviews that her brother did not speak for the first 20 minutes of the drive. Detective Roger Wexman, who had retired from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department in 2017, was subject to a state attorney general's office review beginning in early 2024. The review examined his conduct in the Marvin Cole case and also examined 3 other cases in which Wexman had been the lead investigator and in which witnesses had given testimony with similar profiles. The review was completed in late 2024. It identified 1 additional case in which the witness had since recanted under similar circumstances. The Attorney General's office referred both cases to the State Prosecuting Attorney's Office. As of this recording, no criminal charges have been filed against Roger Wexman. He is 75 years old. He lives in retirement in another state. Donald Rinaldi was not charged with perjury related to the Marvin Cole case. The statute of limitations on perjury in Indiana is 5 years. The 15-year delay in the recantation, while it had cost Marvin Cole 15 years of his life, also placed Rinaldi outside the window of criminal liability. The State Attorney General's office acknowledged this fact in a public statement that drew measured criticism from various commentators. The statement noted that the statute of limitations existed for general principles of legal predictability, and that in the specific case of a recanting witness, the lack of criminal liability arguably made recantation easier to come by, that to extend the limitations period would, on balance, discourage future recantations even from witnesses who had grown to want to tell the truth. That is a fair argument. It is also an argument that does not make Marvin Cole's 15 years any shorter. I want to spend the final part of this video on the broader question Donald Rinaldi's recantation raises, because it is not a question unique to his case. The legal system relies on eyewitness testimony as one of its primary forms of evidence. The reliability of eyewitness testimony has been studied extensively, and the consensus among researchers is that it is much less reliable than the legal system treats it as being. Not only because witnesses make honest mistakes, which they do frequently, but because witnesses are subject to pressures both subtle and overt that can shape their testimony in directions that do not match what they actually observed. The Donald Rinaldi case is a particularly clear example of the latter category. Rinaldi did not make a mistake. He was steered. He was steered by an investigator who needed a witness, and the investigator's steering was effective because Rinaldi had a small vulnerability, a thin connection to an unrelated burglary investigation that the investigator was able to leverage. How often does this happen? The honest answer is that we do not know. Recantations like Donald Rinaldi's are rare in the sense that they require the witness to come forward years or decades later. They are rare in the sense that we have evidence of their occurrence. They are not necessarily rare in the sense of how often the underlying pressure-shaped testimony actually happens. The dark figure of pressured eyewitness testimony, the cases where a witness lied and never recanted, is unknowable. By definition, it stays unknowable. What the Marvin Cole case tells us is that the system's ability to identify and correct this kind of error is limited. It took 15 years and 3 triggering events for one witness to come forward. It took a still-functioning Innocence Project chapter, a new state statute on post-conviction review, advances in DNA technology, an investigator with the time and budget to track down a 10-year-old child grown into an adult, and a court willing to act on the assembled evidence. Most of these elements are not present in most cases. The system that corrected this error was a fragile system. It worked this time. It will not always work. The recommended reforms from researchers who study eyewitness testimony are technical and procedurally specific. Recording all witness interviews, using double-blind procedures for identification, auditing case files for patterns associated with high-pressure witness convictions. These reforms have been adopted in some jurisdictions and resisted in others. The resistance is institutional, not empirical. The cost of adopting them is real but modest. The cost of not adopting them is harder to measure, but it has a number. The number in this case is 15 years. Marvin Cole has been out of prison for 14 months at the time of this recording. He lives in a rental property owned by his sister, in a neighborhood in the western part of Indianapolis where he did not grow up. He is in the process of working with a state-provided vocational counselor to identify employment that does not require an explanation of a 15-year gap in his resume. He has not given any extended public interviews. The one statement he has released through his sister said in part, "I am not yet a free man in the sense most people mean when they say that word. I am out. The things that being inside took from me are still gone. I am trying to figure out what is left." Donald Rinaldi died in February 2025, approximately 15 months after his recorded statement. The cancer that had been described as slow progressing in early 2023 had progressed faster than initial projections. He had, in the period between his recantation and his death, spoken at one community panel on wrongful conviction reform. He had also written a letter to Marvin Cole, delivered through the Innocence Project. The contents of the letter have not been made public. Marvin Cole has not responded to it. He has said, through his sister, that he is not yet ready and may never be. Patricia Rinaldi's grave is in a small cemetery in the town where Donald Rinaldi spent most of his adult life. Donald is buried next to her. The headstones are identical in size and style. The dates on Donald's headstone read 1955-2025. The dates on Patricia's read 1958-2023. There is nothing on either headstone that would suggest either of them had ever heard the name Marvin Cole. The newspaper article that Donald Rinaldi read in April 2023, the one that had described Marvin Cole's last available legal avenue, is on file at the Central Branch of the Indianapolis Public Library. The library keeps bound volumes of the local newspaper going back decades. The article appeared on page B7 of the April 27 edition. It is approximately 700 words long. There is a small black and white photograph of Marvin Cole at the top of the article. It is the photograph from his original 2008 booking. He is 26 in the photograph. He is looking directly at the camera. The library volume sits on a shelf in the periodicals room, between bound volumes of slightly older newspapers and slightly newer ones, alphabetized by publication and ordered by date. If you know what page to turn to, you can find it. If you do not, you would never know it was there at all.